It is often said that ancient people lived in simpler times. But back then, if bad luck was on your side and you broke the law, life would not have been so simple. From classical antiquity to much of the early modern era, in times of limited criminal law, brutal tortures were a norm. Fences wouldn't have landed you in a prison, but may have your limbs dislocated on the breaking wheel or fingers chopped off in the public. This is Mr. Jam Speaks, highlighting some of the very gruesome punishments we had in our past. There is nothing worse than being burned alive. While this form of punishment was quite popular during the Middle Ages, it fell out of practice as types of fuel other than wood became abundant and affordable. In history, we see that the Ottoman government would routinely burn Armenians by the dozens. Then there is this case of Buddhist monks in Vietnam who would self-immolate to bring an end to the suffering. Death by fire was rampant in those times. The pear of anguish, also known as choke pear, is an ancient device used to torture criminals usually accused of blasphemy. The apparatus consisted of 3 to 4 metal leaves with a screw mechanism on top, which would open up upon turning. It was forced into suspect's rectum with full force. While inside, the torturers would slowly turn the screw to open up the metal gear, inflicting pain and injuries. The unbearable suffering and loss of blood would ultimately lead to death. The iron chair was a fairly popular torture instrument in medieval Europe. The features of the iron chair varied from time to time. In one instance, the iron chair featured hundreds of tiny spikes on its seat, armrest and leg rest. Though these spikes were not able to penetrate human organs, death was caused by infection, excessive blood loss and trauma. While in other cases, culprits were seated onto the chair with brass plates placed directly above a blazing fire, slowly grilling them alive. The iron chair had more of a psychological effect than physical. Torturers often forced other culprits to witness victims in distress to obtain required details. Crucifixion was a well-known practice in the Middle Ages and has been used as a preferred method of torture in which victims were nailed to a large wooden plank, commonly known as the gibbet, and were left hanging until they finally succumbed to death. Sometimes, the agent in charge of carrying out the execution would break the legs of the criminal with a big rod. While on other occasions, the person in charge would stab the criminals as they hung them with the nails. The idea was not to kill the criminal instantly, but to make him suffer the slow death. The practice was usually carried out in public to generate terror among its witnesses, leaving them mentally too crippled to commit any crime in the future. The earliest known archaeological evidence of crucifixion was found in 1968 at a small Israeli colony in Jerusalem. Death by sawing was a fairly common sight in Europe and many Asian countries during the Middle Ages. As brutal as it gets, the victims were sawed in half. The executions were often witnessed by the public either by their own will or forcibly. In ancient times, the Romans, Persians, Jews and Egyptians all sawed people to death. Most horrendous of its types was the one where the agent would string criminals upside down and saw them from between their legs to their abdomen, where they would slowly bleed to death. The idea was to let the blood rush to their heads, which would keep the criminals half-conscious throughout the whole horrific process, increasing their agony beyond imagination. The breaking wheel or the execution wheel resembled a large wagon wheel with radial bars, although small modifications were often added. It is most likely to have originated from France and was widely used during public executions in medieval Europe. This hideous practice involved strapping the criminal to a wooden wheel, and then he was beaten by an iron club until every limb in his body was broken. This led to excruciatingly painful death. Much to the horror, Several accounts exist of victims being conscious for several days before taking their last breath. Rat torture is as barbaric as it sounds. Though there had been many variations of this type of execution, the most common way included forcing rats pass through the gut area of the victim. The culprit would be stripped naked with both legs and hands tied on a flat surface. A cage would be placed on the convict's torso with rats on one side and hot charcoal on the other. The cage would slowly begin to heat, leaving rats with no choice but to eat through the victim's body if they wanted to escape the heat. And the very next moment, you will see the rats aggressively biting and eating away victims' flesh. Rat torture is alleged to have been used as currently as the 1980s by military governments and intelligence agencies in Latin America. Flaying was a torture technique in which the skin was removed from the subject's body. People were often penalized and tortured in the early ages by being skinned alive. Depending on the amount of skin removed, they either died on spot or lived a life full of agony. Flaying could induce shock, trauma, and loss of bodily fluids, ultimately leading to death. Similarly, people were also executed by getting chunks of flesh removed from their body. Remnants of human skin, possibly from torture, have been discovered in Essex, England. The earliest known practice of flaying is dated back to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. In medieval Europe, traitors were often flayed or skinned alive in public. There have been very unusual and cruel ways of punishing the suspects throughout the history of mankind, but the orifice-based tactics seem to take the lead, for it involves pain, misery, trauma, and humiliation all at the same time. Different orifices of the body would be penetrated for different crimes in this horrifying method. Impalement involved hammering a sharpened stick into a criminal's body, then hoisting up the criminal and letting gravity pull the criminal slowly back down to the ground. After going through hours of humiliation and agonizing pain, the stick would eventually come out through the victim's head or shoulders, killing him miserably. In another instance, a chair with a spiked pyramid on top was used for this purpose. The culprit was stripped naked and seated. Heavy weights were used to speed up the process, eventually tearing apart one of the most sensitive parts of the human body. This method of execution was quite rampant in the world at one point in time. In Western culture, people convicted for treason or crimes against the state would be punished like this.